Hey everybody, this is part one of Anselm Jappe's Guy Debord book. The part one is titled The Concept of the Spectacle, and the first section is titled Must We Burn Debord? Or Debord. Some historical periods display a strong belief in the power of critical thought. Cases in point are the reigns of Qin Shi Huangdi, the Chinese emperor who organized the first book burnings in history, or the age that condemned Anaxagoras and Socrates, or the one that burned Bruno and Vanini at the stake. As recently as 20 years ago in the Iran of the Shah, a schoolteacher was sent to prison for life because he owned a copy of Hegel's Science of Logic. Our own era, however, meaning the last few decades in the West, has not unreasonably treated its thinkers as completely harmless individuals. Many a self-proclaimed sworn enemy of the world as it is has fallen rapturously into the welcoming arms of academia or of television. Guy Debord, though, must surely be numbered among the very few people deemed quite beyond the pale. For a long time, in fact, the police showed far more interest in Debord than did the agencies normally responsible for the diffusion of ideas. A time came, however, when this attitude could no longer prevent the theories developed by Debord and his Situationist friends from leaving their mark, despite all obstacles on the spirit of the times. Since then, another way of obscuring Debord's thinking has come into play, namely trivialization. There must be very few present-day authors whose ideas have been so widely applied in a distorted form and generally without attribution. That we live in a, quote, society of the spectacle, end quote, is acknowledged by almost everyone, by television producers, by President Jacques Chirac, by the lowliest of mere spectators. The phrase seems practically de rigueur in every discussion of the invasion of life by the mass media, every denunciation of the effects on children as of being stuck from babyhood on in front of the television screen. Likewise, the, quote, spectacularization, end quote, of information is universally deplored, a propos of the reporting of tragic events such as wars and catastrophes. Occasionally, a slightly better informed commentator will mention that these terms are derived from the title of a book by a certain Debord, who is thus, by implication, depicted as a kind of less well-known Marshall McLuhan. Further details are rarely supplied. Whether such, quote, disinformation, end quote, is to be regretted is an open question. As an Austrian socialist of the first half of this century said, quote, when I began reading Marx, I was surprised never to have heard his name mentioned at school. When I began to understand Marx, I was no longer surprised in the least, end quote. When Marxist theories are reduced to a simple economic doctrine concerning the supposedly inevitable pauperization of the proletariat, it is easy enough to trumpet the error of his thought. Here is a Marx eminently suitable for classroom discussion. A similar intent informs the presentation of Debord's ideas as nothing more than a theory of the mass media. A few scientific points are then summarily conceded, and the remainder of what he says passed over in silence. Nor is such a juxtaposition of Debord and Marx particularly arbitrary. A period that seeks to use the collapse of the Soviet bureaucratic despotism and the seeming triumph of the world's model of social organization as weapons with which to deliver the coup de grace to everything remotely related to Marxist thought, could hardly fail to be irked by one of the few theories of Marxist inspiration that has been confirmed repeatedly by the developments of the last 30 years. There is another reason, too, why an analogy between Debord and Marx is not an arbitrary analogy. Debord's theories cannot be properly grasped unless Debord's theories are first properly located within Marxist thought in general. Some people will doubtless find this surprising and question the idea that Debord might be of interest on account of his interpretation of Marx. Was not Debord first and foremost the representative of an artistic avant-garde that sought to transcend art by means of, quote, détournement, dérive, and play, and, quote, unitary urbanism? Surely the fulcrum of Situationist agitation was the, quote, revolution of everyday life, end quote. These things certainly played an important part, yet placing all the emphasis on them means playing down Debord's theoretico-practical activity, burying Debord in effect in the great cemetery of past avant-gardes, ultimately, according to Debord, no significance for the present time save that of some, quote, father of the video neo-avant-garde, or, quote, end quote, or, quote, precursor of punk, end quote. And these labels are not made up. This kind of incomprehension is likewise betrayed by the ever more prevalent use of the word, quote, situationism, end quote, a term the Situationists themselves rejected from the outset on the grounds that it perversely froze their ideas into a dogma. The chief concern of this study is the relevance to the present time of the notion of the, quote, spectacle, end quote, as developed by Debord, and its utility in the construction of a critical theory of contemporary society. The intention is to show that the spectacle is the most highly developed form of a society based on commodity production and its corollary, the, quote, fetishism of commodities, end quote. It is hoped that the real significance of this last concept will be clarified by showing the extent to which it constitutes a key to the understanding of the world of today, where the results of human activity are so antagonistic to humanity itself that they now threaten you with extinction through ecological catastrophe or war. We shall be touching on the pertinence for the present day of a central portion of Marxist thought, the critique of the fetishism of commodities, and in this context considering Debord's relationship to those minority strands in Marxism which have defined themselves in terms of that pivotal topic. The main aim is to advance understanding of the theoretical issues while shedding light on the relationship between Debord and his contemporaries. Certain issues, among them the question of revolutionary organization, will be given short shrift here because, whatever importance they once had, discussion of them now tends to resemble the Byzantine debate on the human versus the divine nature of Christ. Nor shall we devote much space to anecdotal or biographical details which have been fairly well documented elsewhere. We will, however, be considering Debord's practical activity, his life, and what might be called his, quote, myth, end quote, for they partake of an overarching desire for a rich life full of passion, not of passive contemplation, and embody a will to destroy whatever at present makes such a life impossible. Aside from a growing disgust for those who use Marx to justify their gulags and their nomenclatura, it seemed in the 1960s that a good many Marxists or supposedly Marxist theories were outdated. These were years when capitalism showed no signs of any inability to increase its productive forces. It even seemed quite capable of ensuring a somewhat more equitable distribution than formerly of what capitalism produced. This gave the lie to the belief that a revolution would be made by workers suffering ever greater poverty. Critical social thought proceeded to ask the most general, most simple, yet least frequently raised questions. What use was being made of the immense accumulation of means now at society's disposal? Had life as actually experienced by ordinary individuals become richer? The answer clearly was negative. Whereas the power of society overall appeared to be limitless, the individual was deprived of any control over his own world. Unlike many others, Debord did not interpret this state of affairs as an inevitable reversal of progress or as the fate of modern man, to which there was no alternative but an improbable return to the past. Rather, Debord attributed the situation to the fact that the economy had brought human life under the sway of its own laws. Debord attributed the situation to the fact that the economy had brought human life under the sway of its own laws. Consequently, no change emanating from within the economic sphere would be sufficient so long as the economy itself was not subordinated to the conscious control of individuals. In what follows, an attempt will be made to explain on the basis of Debord's own statements how this claim differs from similar-sounding formulations that even the Pope might utter. The modern economy and the modern economy's existence as a detached sphere will be analyzed here as the consequences of the commodity, of exchange value, of abstract labor, and of the form of value. These are the topics that need addressing. This has in fact been the concern since the time of the First World War of a minority tendency within Marxism that assigns central importance to the problem of alienation, considered not as an ephemeral but as crucial to capitalist development. It is true that this still implies a very philosophical approach. The essential point, however, is the stress laid on the fact that the economy, once the economy has achieved autonomy, and no matter what form the economy's development takes, can only be antagonistic to human life. The leading figure in this strain of Marxism is the Georg Lukács of History and Class Consciousness, published in 1923, who took up the further elaborated the Marxian critique of the, quote, fetishism of commodities, end quote, in view of the transformation that had occurred in social reality since Marx's time. Still later, armed with the arguments of both Marx and Lukács, Debord would attempt to construct a theory of a particular variant of commodity fetishism that had arisen in the interim that he called, quote, the spectacle, end quote. It is thus essential, if one is effectively to grasp the ideas set forth by Debord in the Society of the Spectacle, published in 1967, to attend closely to his sources, to which he owes more. The much is slip of the tongue, to which he owes more than might at first be supposed. This is in no sense to diminish the originality of Debord's work, one of whose chief merits is that it adapts the earlier theories to a very different period. As he himself remarks in his autobiographical panegyric, published in 1989, quote, men are more knowledgeable than I have explained. Men more knowledgeable than I have explained very well the origin of what has come to pass, end quote. Following which observation, Debord quotes his own earlier paraphrase of the Marxian theory of exchange value. The Society of the Spectacle does not contain any quotations as such. When they do, their purpose is to buttress Debord's assertions rather than to acknowledge his sources. A careful reading of the book reveals, however, that Debord hews narrowly to the Lukácsian tradition in Marxism, refining certain aspects of it and sharing certain of its problems. To trace the development of the critique of alienation in Marx, Lukács, and Debord is not, however, to endorse Debord's claim, apropos of the Society of the Spectacle, that, quote, there have doubtless not been 3 books of social criticism of such importance in the last 100 years, end quote. Debord's writings are not easily susceptible of paraphrase. For one thing, Debord's writing stylistic elegance militates against it, and for another there is a danger of, quote, over-interpretation, end quote. Inevitably, therefore, it will be necessary to quote a good deal. As Debord himself emphasized, he wrote little, and when it seemed to him necessary. No text of Debord's was ever written to order at the request of an editor under the pressure of a contractual deadline. Any attempt at exegesis must confront the problem that Debord's work, for all its succinctness, claims to have said everything essential, explicitly refusing interpretation and demanding to be followed, so to speak, to the letter. For a very long time, Debord approved of no reading of his thought that was not strictly literal, indeed tantamount to a pure reproduction of the original text. There's some footnotes here that I missed. I think I'm actually going to read this book section by section as opposed to chapter by chapter, because these chapters are very long and people don't like to listen to long chapters. So the footnotes that I missed, not overt quotations, that is, very many passages of Debord's book are, quote, détournements of statements by other authors. 3. Next footnote. Unfortunately, we are not told what the other 2 books might be, or whether indeed they include Capital, Marx's Capital, which was published almost exactly a century before the Society of the Spectacle. And next footnote. In this respect, and in this respect only, there's a parallel to be drawn between Debord and Wittgenstein. Thanks for listening.